April 1945. Nazi Germany was collapsing. The war that Adolf Hitler had started across Europe was approaching its final days. From the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing toward Berlin. From the west, American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces were moving through Germany. German cities had been devastated. Factories were damaged. Railways were destroyed. Millions of German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Yet Hitler refused to surrender. Berlin would become the final major battlefield of Nazi Germany. The Soviet offensive toward Berlin began in April 1945. The Red Army had enormous forces positioned east of the German capital. Thousands of tanks and artillery pieces were ready. Soviet commanders knew that Berlin was the political and military center of Nazi Germany. Capturing the city would effectively destroy the German government. The main Soviet attack began on April 16. Massive artillery bombardments struck German defensive positions. The night sky around the German capital was illuminated by explosions. Soviet troops crossed the Oder River and pushed toward the German defenses. The German army was no longer the force it had been earlier in the war. Many experienced soldiers were gone. Some units consisted of young recruits. Others included older men who had been called into military service as the situation became desperate. The Germans had fewer tanks, less fuel, and fewer aircraft. But they still possessed artillery, defensive positions, and determined soldiers. The area around Berlin had been prepared for defense. German forces established several defensive lines. Roads were blocked. Anti-tank weapons were positioned. Buildings were prepared as strongpoints. The city itself was becoming a fortress. Soviet forces pushed through the German defenses. The fighting was intense. German units attempted to slow the advance. But the Soviet army had overwhelming numerical and material superiority. The Red Army had spent years fighting the German military. Its commanders had gained enormous experience. Its soldiers had learned how to attack fortified positions. Its artillery and armored formations were extremely powerful. The Soviet advance continued toward Berlin. Meanwhile, Hitler remained inside his underground headquarters. The Führerbunker was located beneath the Reich Chancellery in central Berlin. Inside, Hitler received reports about the collapsing military situation. The reports became increasingly desperate. German armies were retreating. Soviet troops were approaching from the east. Western Allied forces were advancing from the west. There was little possibility of stopping them. Yet Hitler continued issuing orders. He demanded counterattacks from units that barely existed. Some formations listed on military maps had almost no soldiers or equipment. Orders were given for forces to attack the Soviet army. But the reality on the ground was very different. German soldiers were exhausted. Fuel was limited. Ammunition was running low. The Luftwaffe could no longer provide meaningful air support. The once powerful German war machine was collapsing. By April 20th, Soviet forces were approaching Berlin. That same day was Hitler's birthday. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was grim. Outside, artillery fire could be heard. The city was already being heavily damaged. Hitler made his final public appearance on the surface. He met members of the Hitler Youth who had been awarded decorations. The scene reflected how desperate the situation had become. Children were being used in the defense of the collapsing regime. The Soviet advance continued. Berlin was becoming surrounded. German civilians attempted to find shelter. Many hid in basements. Hospitals became overcrowded. Food became increasingly difficult to obtain. Water supplies were disrupted. Electricity failed in many areas. The city was under constant artillery fire. The streets were filled with rubble. Buildings were burning. Soviet tanks moved closer to the center. German defenders used anti-tank weapons against them. Some streets became deadly corridors. Soviet infantry followed tanks into the city. The fighting was now occurring block by block. Unlike the open battlefields of earlier years, Berlin was an enormous urban battlefield. Buildings became defensive positions. Railway stations became strongpoints. Government buildings became military targets. Soviet troops had to clear one structure after another. German soldiers and civilians were trapped inside the city. Some German units fought fiercely. Others surrendered. Many simply disappeared as the defensive system collapsed. Hitler continued believing that relief forces might arrive. He expected German formations to attack the Soviet army from different directions. But those forces were either too weak, too far away, or already destroyed. The Soviet encirclement tightened. On April 25th, Soviet forces met near the Elbe River with American troops advancing from the west. The meeting became symbolic. Germany had effectively been divided between the advancing Allied armies. Berlin was surrounded. The final battle had begun. Inside the city, Soviet artillery continued firing. Soviet troops moved toward the government district. The Reichstag became one of the most important objectives. German defenders prepared positions around the building. The fighting became extremely intense. Soviet troops pushed forward through streets filled with destroyed vehicles and rubble. The German defenders fought with whatever weapons remained. Some used rifles. Others used machine guns. Anti-tank weapons were used against Soviet armor. But the balance was overwhelming. The Soviet army continued advancing. Hitler's bunker remained underground. The people inside knew that the end was approaching. Hitler's military leadership had largely collapsed. The war was lost. But Hitler refused to leave Berlin. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun inside the bunker. The following day, April 30th, Hitler died by suicide. The Nazi dictator who had launched the European war was dead. But the fighting in Berlin continued. Soviet troops were still attacking German positions. The Reichstag became a major objective. On April 30th, Soviet soldiers reached the building. Fighting continued around it. The famous Soviet flag-raising photograph associated with the Reichstag was taken during the battle, although the image was staged and later reproduced. The military significance was still enormous. The Soviet flag above the Reichstag became a symbol of the destruction of Nazi Germany. Berlin was collapsing. German commanders realized there was almost no chance of changing the outcome. Some attempted to negotiate surrender. Others continued fighting. On May 2nd, the German defenders in Berlin finally surrendered. The battle for the capital was over. But the war in Europe continued for several more days. Germany's new government attempted to negotiate with the Allies. The Western Allies and the Soviet Union demanded unconditional surrender. On May 7th, Germany signed the surrender documents at Reims, France. A second signing took place in Berlin on May 8th. The war in Europe was over. Victory in Europe became known as VE Day. The collapse of Berlin marked the end of Nazi Germany as a military power. The city itself had been devastated. Large areas were destroyed. Thousands of civilians had died. German soldiers were dead, wounded, or prisoners. Soviet casualties were enormous as well. The human cost of the final battle was immense. But the significance went far beyond Berlin. The fall of the city marked the end of one of the darkest periods in European history. The Nazi regime had occupied much of Europe. It had launched a war that killed millions. It had carried out mass persecution and genocide. By May 1945, that regime had been destroyed. The Soviet army now controlled Berlin. American, British, and other Allied armies controlled large parts of Germany. Europe was entering a completely new era. But Berlin was not simply a military victory. It was also a symbol. The city that had been the center of Nazi power was now occupied by the victorious Allies. The Reich Chancellery was damaged. Government buildings were destroyed. The streets were filled with military vehicles and rubble. The famous image of the Soviet flag over the Reichstag became one of the defining photographs of the war. But behind the photographs were millions of individual stories. Soldiers who had fought across Europe for years. Civilians who had survived years of bombing. Families separated by war. Prisoners who were finally liberated. Refugees moving through destroyed cities. And soldiers who never returned home. The Battle of Berlin was therefore not simply the final battle of a military campaign. It was the physical collapse of Nazi Germany. The Soviet army had fought from the outskirts of Moscow all the way to Berlin. The journey had taken nearly 4 years. In 1941, Germany had expected a rapid victory over the Soviet Union. By 1945, Soviet troops were fighting inside Berlin. The transformation was extraordinary. The German army that had once seemed unstoppable had been defeated. The Western Allies had crossed France and Belgium. The Soviet Union had advanced through Eastern Europe. Germany was surrounded. The final days were inevitable, but they were still incredibly violent. German resistance continued until the final hours. The streets of Berlin became dangerous. Tanks moved carefully through intersections. Infantry searched buildings. Snipers fired from ruins. Artillery struck defensive positions. Smoke filled the air. The city became a maze of destroyed streets and burning buildings. The Soviet victory came at a tremendous cost. The Red Army lost many soldiers during the assault on Berlin. The battle was one of the bloodiest final operations of the European war. Yet Soviet commanders understood the symbolic importance of capturing the capital. Berlin had to fall. The Nazi regime had to be destroyed, and the war had to end. When the German surrender was finally signed, the European conflict was over. The continent was devastated. Germany lay in ruins. Millions of people had died. Millions more were displaced. The Allied victory brought relief, but it also revealed the enormous destruction left behind. Europe now faced the difficult task of rebuilding. Germany would be divided into occupation zones. Berlin itself would also be divided. The political divisions that followed would shape the next decades of European history. The Battle of Berlin therefore became the end of one war and the beginning of another era. The Cold War would soon emerge. The former Allies would become rivals. Berlin itself would eventually become one of the most important symbols of that division. But in May 1945, the immediate reality was simpler. The war in Europe was over. The Nazi regime was gone. The German army had surrendered. The Allied armies had won. The Battle of Berlin remains one of the most important military operations of World War II. It was the final major battle on the European battlefield. It demonstrated the enormous power of the Soviet military. It showed the complete collapse of German military resistance. And it brought an end to Hitler's regime. The war that had begun in Europe in 1939 had finally reached its conclusion. 6 years of conflict had transformed the continent. Cities had been destroyed. Borders had changed. Millions had been killed. And a new world order was beginning. Berlin stood at the center of that transformation. The Nazi flag had disappeared. The Soviet flag flew over the Reichstag. And the German surrender marked the final defeat of Nazi Germany. The battle was over. The guns would soon become silent. But the consequences of Berlin would shape Europe for generations.